Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
Can you guess what happened next? My parents told me, straight-faced, that they were too busy to come to my graduation, as if that sentence could be dropped into conversation and left there like a crumpled napkin no one would pick up. And for a moment, I almost believed them until I saw the photos they had posted that same afternoon, all smiles and applause at Michael's golf outing, shaking hands with sponsors and captioning the day as a family triumph. I kept quiet, not because it didn't cut deep, but because I had learned over the years that when you answer immediately you hand them control of the frame, and I wanted to choose my moment. That moment came when I walked across the stage as valedictorian, a fact I had kept mostly to myself out of habit and maybe out of a twisted sense of curiosity about whether they would ever see me if I didn't shine a spotlight on myself. And when I stood at the podium, looking out over a sea of faces that were not theirs, I decided my speech would be my answer. The dean had asked me to keep it inspirational, to stay safe with gratitude and perseverance cliches, but I couldn't pretend that my path had been built on steady encouragement, not when most nights I had been closing shifts at the grocery store to cover rent, juggling loan payments while listening to Michael's travel plans being dissected at the dinner table as if they were a family summit, and so instead of pretending that my support system had been balanced, I told the truth, carefully, strategically, but unmistakably. I thanked the professors who never once treated me as a background character. I thanked classmates who loaned me notes when I missed lectures for work. And then I said, clear enough for every microphone in the room, to those who never believed, thank you for the fuel. For half a second there was silence, the kind that makes you wonder if you just destroyed your own future, and then the room shifted, some students clapping louder than expected, some parents looking at each other, and I walked off the stage without looking back at the empty chairs I had half hoped my parents might have filled at the last minute. By the time I made it back to my apartment, the clip had already started spreading. Someone had trimmed the line, put subtitles under it, and thrown it on TikTok and Facebook with captions like, "When your parents ditch you for your brother." Comments started pouring in, strangers calling me brave, others calling me bitter, and the ones that stung most, people I recognized from my hometown writing soft little barbs about how we never know the whole story, which was their polite way of siding with my parents without saying so directly. My phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, but the one that cut through all of it was a text from my mom, a screenshot of her budget spreadsheet where she had highlighted every textbook she had ever helped me buy, conveniently skipping the part where Michael's golf trips, tournament fees, and new gear filled entire pages. "This is what family sacrifice looks like," she wrote, as if a couple $100s of books balanced out the tens of thousands funneled into keeping Michael on brand. I wanted to fire back, but I knew better than to give them ammunition they could twist later, so I set the phone down and ate cold pasta straight from the container, reminding myself that silence is not weakness, sometimes silence is strategy. Then Aunt Linda called, the one relative who never sugarcoats anything, and she told me flat out not to backpedal, not to fix a moment that had simply exposed reality. I believed her, though my chest still felt heavy with the knowledge that even my win would be reframed as an attack. And then, just when I thought the day couldn't hold more contradictions, my phone lit up with a voicemail from Michael. His voice, quieter than I had ever heard it, said, "Ratch, I messed up. Don't call Mom. Don't call Dad. I'll figure it out." No details, no explanations, just those clipped words and the weight of secrecy he wanted me to share. I sat on my couch, replaying that voicemail, trying to decide if it was a plea for help or a warning to stay out of whatever storm he had walked into. What struck me most was not the content, but the choice of recipient. He hadn't called our parents, the very people who built their world around him. He had called me, the sister he barely texted back, the one he mostly treated like an audience to his highlight reel. I thought about calling him right away, but I stopped myself, because in our family there was always an unspoken rule. If you tell someone don't loop in Mom and Dad, it means you're in deeper than anyone wants to admit. As the night stretched long, I lay awake not with triumph from my speech, but with a question that gnawed at me harder than any online comment or family post ever could. Why had Michael chosen me as the keeper of his secret, and what exactly had he done that made him so certain our parents must not know? By the next morning, the fallout from my speech had grown legs of its own, moving faster than I could track or respond to, because even though I had never posted a single clip or made any public statement beyond the words I spoke on stage, the internet had done what it always does when there is a whiff of family drama tied to something ceremonial, and within hours there were threads on Facebook filled with commentary from people who hadn't seen me in years, but still felt qualified to weigh in on whether I had been ungrateful or courageous, while local community groups were already speculating about what kind of rift could have driven me to dedicate my moment to those who never believed. My parents, not surprisingly, jumped straight into damage control mode, with my mother writing a carefully worded post about being unable to attend due to unavoidable work commitments, followed by a declaration of how proud she was of both her children, and the comments under it filled with heart emojis, church friends praising their sacrifices, and more than a few subtle digs at me, suggesting that I had let bitterness overshadow gratitude, which in Midwestern language is the same as being branded as selfish. The university caught wind of the situation almost immediately, because by mid-morning I received another call from Dean Wallace's assistant, whose polite tone had shifted into something clipped and managerial, and she informed me that donors are asking questions about the context of my remarks and whether the institution condoned divisive language during commencement addresses, which was ironic considering that my entire speech had been scrubbed clean of names, accusations, or anything resembling direct attack. But because perception often carries more weight than fact in settings where checks are signed, the assistant suggested that I consider clarifying or softening my comments ahead of the upcoming alumni dinner, as though the truth about what my family did and didn't do could be sanded down into a bland anecdote about perseverance. I told her, as calmly as I could, that I hadn't uploaded the clip and that I couldn't retract something that was both accurate and already in circulation, and she tried to pivot by framing it as an opportunity to celebrate family support. That phrase stuck in my head for the rest of the day, because to me family support had always been conditional, measured, and heavily tilted toward Michael, while for them it had always been a brand, a story to present to others, a proof of image rather than substance. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing with private messages, some from classmates congratulating me for speaking up, others from people I barely knew warning me that my parents were hurting over the embarrassment and that maybe I should fix it, as though my role in life had always been to patch over wounds they had inflicted, and the absurdity of it might have been laughable if it weren't so heavy. Just when I thought the entire day would be consumed by this cycle of spin, my neighbor Renee Porter showed up at my apartment with a travel mug in her hand and the kind of calm, practical energy that immediately reset the room. Renee, who had once been a journalist before going to law school, told me point blank that I needed to save every screenshot, every message, and every version of my speech with metadata intact, because institutions protect themselves first. Families often protect their golden child, and without a record the truth can be rewritten in ways you can't undo later. She listened to Michael's voicemail, the one where he admitted he had messed up and begged me not to involve our parents, and she didn't overreact or speculate wildly. She just said, "That message is proof he trusted you with something. And you need to be careful with that trust." Her words carried a weight I didn't even realize I needed. Around mid-afternoon, while Renee and I were still talking through strategy, my phone lit up again, this time with a call from an unknown number. And when I let it go to voicemail, I discovered it was a police officer saying that my mother had requested a wellness check on Michael because she couldn't reach him, which startled me not only because I had his voicemail still fresh in my mind, but because I had also just received a text from a number I didn't recognize that read, "Don't give them my location. I'm not hurt. I just need time, M." The contradiction between the officer's words and Michael's message sat like a stone in my stomach, because either someone was lying, or someone was covering, or both, and the uncertainty felt sharper than anything I had dealt with up to that point. Renee looked at me and said something that has stayed with me: "You have to decide who you're responsible to, not who people tell you you're responsible to." It wasn't advice dressed up as comfort, it was a line in the sand, and it forced me to face the fact that my loyalty to truth had to outweigh my loyalty to optics, even if that meant my parents would paint me as disloyal. That evening Karen and David finally called, their voices together on speakerphone, and they launched into a speech about disappointment, about how my tone had hurt the family, about how Michael's potential was tied to donors who believe in us, and about how I needed to fix the narrative at the alumni dinner to protect our image. My father used the word optics like it was sacred, while my mother alternated between sharp scolding and teary pleas. I didn't tell them about Michael's voicemail, not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because I could see how quickly they would twist his words to serve their own cover story. When the call ended, I felt a strange calm, the kind that doesn't erase the storm but makes you realize you've already survived the worst part, and Renee, sitting across from me, tapped her mug against the table like a gavel and said, "Expect a bigger ask tomorrow." She was right, but what I didn't expect was that the next twist would arrive sooner than that, and in a form that made me question whether I could believe any official word at all. Because only an hour later the same officer called again, his voice brisk and certain, saying the wellness check was over because Michael had just walked into the station on his own, which should have been reassuring. Except at that exact moment my phone buzzed with another message from Michael, typed fast, almost desperate, saying, "Not true, I'm not there." And in that instant the ground shifted beneath me, because either the police were covering for him, or he was hiding from them, or someone else was pulling the strings. But whichever way it was, the truth and the official story had just split apart, and I was stuck in the middle with no idea which version would blow up first. By late morning a courier knocked on my door and handed me a stiff envelope with a green stripe that required a signature, and while I knew enough to expect something unpleasant, I still felt that old childlike hope that maybe the world would surprise me with kindness. Only to open the envelope on my kitchen counter and find a letter from counsel for Pine Ridge Foundation claiming, with the kind of sterile confidence only lawyers and banks carry, that my remarks had created confusion regarding the Foundation's programs, and that Pine Ridge expected a clarifying statement before the alumni dinner, which was their polite way of saying that Pine Ridge wanted me to soften reality until it felt like a marketing line that would not smudge their donor brochures. And as I stood there with that letter spreading its chill through my apartment, I realized that this was no longer just a family story. This was a machine checking whether I would fold. Renee arrived within minutes, because Renee had told me to call her the second anything official showed up, and when Renee read the letter she did not gasp or perform outrage. She simply underlined the phrases that did the most work for them, and then said in a voice so steady it shut the panic in my chest down, "They are not suing, they are testing, and you will not give them a single sentence they can frame." And then Renee drafted a short reply that confirmed receipt, rejected the premise without drama, and promised nothing beyond what we had already said, which was truth and boundaries, while I made copies of the envelope because Renee said the postmark would matter later. And in that moment, I understood what it means to have an adult in your corner who has survived institutions and knows where they hide the exits. The calls from Karen came in a string of missed rings that I declined on purpose, because I already knew the script and I did not trust myself to keep my tone even if Karen started crying or if David got on speaker and began talking about optics again. And instead I sent Aunt Linda a photo of the letter and asked the only question that mattered, which was whether Aunt Linda had seen anything in the family threads that suggested Pine Ridge had been flapping about this behind the scenes, and Aunt Linda wrote back that Tom Halpern had been calming donors, which is a phrase that says too much and too little, and then Aunt Linda added, "I've got screenshots. Come get them," and I felt the strange relief that comes when the truth starts to grow teeth of its own. Renee asked for my scholarship files, including any drafts, and when I opened the folder with my essays, the one that mattered most glowed like a bruise, because I remembered exactly where I wrote it. At a campus computer lab at 2 a.m. with no heat working that night, and my hands numb on the keyboard while I tried to explain to a committee what perseverance means when it looks like second jobs and the hum of a grocery cooler at midnight. And Renee said she wanted to check the metadata, which meant the hidden timestamps and author fields that live under the hood of files, and then Renee asked a question that felt like it had been waiting in the room for years, which was whether I had ever sent any part of the essay to family, and I said yes. I had texted a paragraph to Karen to show her the style the committee seemed to want, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I felt the rest of the dominoes line up. Here is the part where I will say something that will make half the comments accuse me of lying and the other half scramble to do the math out loud, and I am fine with both, because the contradiction is deliberate, and yes, I said it on purpose. I graduated from high school at 20, which I know is older than the typical age and also younger if you squint hard enough, and I get that none of that adds up the way you want it to, but the point, which will matter in a minute, is that the paperwork from back then still exists, and it carries dates that are inconvenient for people who expect memory to be elastic, and you can argue about my age all day, but the documents are what they are. By the time Aunt Linda arrived with her tote bag of receipts, Renee had already heard from Ms. Carter in the department, the administrator. Every student owes a thank you card to even if they never realize it, and Ms. Carter, in the quiet tone adults use when they trust you not to waste their courage, said that one of the leadership applications from last summer had been flagged for language overlap, but resolved internally, which is bureaucratic for someone smoothed it over because it was easier. And then Aunt Linda spread out the screenshots on my table, and there it was, a chain of messages where David pushed Michael to meet deliverables for Pine Ridge's youth program, posts, appearances, and language about giving back, while Tom chimed in about keeping the scholarship pipeline clean, and in the middle of it a Google Doc preview with a title that made my skin go cold, The Cost of Drive, which used the same cadence and the same image from my essay about working late in the hum of the cooler, swap a noun here, adjust a verb there, and suddenly the life I had lived became an anecdote framed as Michael's moral backbone. I did not yell and I did not cry, because what I felt was not dramatic sadness. It was the hollow thud you get when a fact lands and rearranges the furniture in your head, and Renee, who missed nothing, said calmly, "This is not sibling rivalry. This is misrepresentation to a nonprofit and the university." And then Renee called Pine Ridge's counsel to acknowledge their letter and inform them that we would not be clarifying anything, but that we would be happy to deliver a timeline of authorship if they insisted on keeping the conversation formal. And while she spoke, my phone flashed again with Karen's name. And when I finally answered to stop the noise, Karen launched into a cascade of phrases that sounded like they had been crowdsourced from people who feared donor discomfort more than they feared dishonesty, telling me to let this go, to celebrate family support, and to not embarrass Michael, while David took the phone and said the part out loud, which was that Michael's opportunities were our shared future, as if my life were a sidecar on their plan for my brother. I asked one question, not because I thought I would get a clean answer, but because I wanted the refusal recorded inside me, and I asked whether Karen had ever shared my essay with Michael, and Karen said no, so quickly the words slid on the kitchen tile. While David said, "We are a team," which is not an answer but a slogan for people who want you to stop asking questions. And before I could say anything else, Renee walked to the door and introduced herself with the kind of handshake that resets a room, and Renee, without raising her voice, explained to Karen and David that any attempt to pressure me into retracting true statements would look very bad for Pine Ridge and for anyone involved. And the performance ended because once there is a witness who cannot be bullied, the script stops working. After they left, my phone lit with a text from Michael, short and tight the way people write when they have been coached too long and suddenly decide to tell the truth. "Do not let them pin this on you. I will handle it." And I typed, "Handle what?" And of course there was no reply, because handle it is a magic phrase people use when they want time to decide which version of the story to sell, and I stood there with the certified letter propped against the toaster and the screenshots spread out and the essay file open on my laptop, and for once I felt something like power, not because I had a platform, but because the pieces connected in a way that made lying expensive for anyone who tried. And then Renee, who had gone quiet while she checked one more filing, looked up with that measured look that means the next sentence changes the room, and said that Pine Ridge's youth leadership stipend listed Tom Halpern as the approving signatory on Michael's application. And the application file included the paragraph that mirrored my essay, which meant the truth was no longer a family argument. It was a document trail with names and dates that did not blink. Once the paper trail was undeniable and the pieces no longer looked like scraps of gossip, but instead lined up into something that could not be waved away with family slogans, the entire atmosphere around me shifted. Because suddenly it wasn't only about whether my parents had favored Michael over me, which everyone already knew in whispers, but about whether Pine Ridge had allowed itself to become complicit in presenting Michael as the shining example of sacrifice and drive while quietly borrowing pieces of my life to build his story. And once that thought began circulating, even in hushed tones, the spin that had protected him for so long began to unravel. Aunt Linda, who never did know how to sit still when a truth was left unspoken, started posting just enough on her page to make people wonder, not an accusation or a direct call-out, but a sharp sentence that carried weight because it came from her. Pride is not proof, and that phrase traveled faster than anything my parents tried to upload about family unity, because when someone outside the immediate circle tells the truth in plain words, people lean in, and for the first time in years the local narrative was not bending toward Michael's benefit. Renee told me it was time to establish terms, which she described as the invisible boundaries that institutions and families alike test constantly, because if you do not state them clearly you will always be accused of shifting your position later. So I wrote them down on paper so there would be no mistaking them. I would attend the alumni dinner as requested. I would give remarks that thanked mentors and spoke to the value of education, and I would not be used as a prop to launder reputations, or to soften the truth about where support did and did not come from. Carrying those terms in writing felt like carrying a weapon I had never been allowed to hold before, because no matter how much my parents pressed me to fix the story, I had a line I could point to, and I was prepared to repeat it without apology. My father tried a new tactic by calling me in a tone that sounded calmer, even measured, but carried the same manipulation, telling me that all communication about this matter should go through the family, because our image was fragile and easily damaged, which to him meant that if I stayed quiet they could do the managing and presenting, and the truth would once again be locked away until it was convenient for Michael's career. My mother followed up with a text message that included a photo of one of Michael's Pine Ridge certificates, with his name printed in glossy letters across the top, as though showing me a piece of paper with gold trim could erase the evidence that the words behind it were stolen. I didn't respond to either, and for the first time I felt no guilt for the silence, only relief that I had stopped playing the role of fixer. When the university asked me to come to a meeting with Dean Wallace and their communications director, I agreed, but only on the condition that Renee came with me, because I had learned fast that nothing said in those rooms is ever truly casual, and walking in with someone who understood the stakes changed the temperature immediately. The communications director opened with polished sentences about everyone wanting what's best and avoiding misunderstandings, before sliding into a suggestion that I join in a joint statement where I would celebrate family support and frame my remarks as a misunderstanding of tone. Renee cut that suggestion down with surgical precision, pointing out that what they were really asking me to do was to undermine my own credibility in order to protect both the university's donors and Pine Ridge's reputation. And when she said that, with her voice calm but firm, Dean Wallace shifted uncomfortably and looked down at the table, which told me everything I needed to know about where the pressure was really coming from. Meanwhile, Ms. Carter, who had been quietly supportive all along, handed me an envelope in private afterward, containing letters signed by 3 faculty members affirming that my scholarship essays and records were my own work and that my achievements had been earned without outside embellishment, and I cannot fully explain the feeling that came over me holding those papers, because for the first time in this fight, someone inside the institution had given me a shield made of facts that no amount of narrative management could easily pierce, and it reminded me that the system does occasionally hold people who refuse to let the truth vanish. It was around this time that Michael reached out again, this time from a number I didn't recognize, asking me to meet him at the driving range after closing, insisting that it be without our parents and without Tom, promising that he needed me to hear his side before reporters got there, and while every instinct told me this could be another setup, I also knew that if he was finally ready to say the words out loud, it was my chance to hear them directly. So I told Renee and Aunt Linda, and together we planned it so that Aunt Linda would wait in her car with the headlights visible while I met him, because safety had to come first, even when it was my own brother. Standing under those fading lights at the range, Michael looked worn in a way I hadn't seen before, his posture sagging, his words clipped and low, and he admitted in the smallest voice that yes, he had borrowed my essay, yes, Tom knew, and yes, our father had pushed him into keeping the story polished because Pine Ridge needed their star to look flawless, and when I asked him whether he understood what it meant for me to have to defend myself while carrying his confession in silence, he just nodded, unable to form an apology that could fit the scale of what he had done. He told me that Pine Ridge was trying to keep everything quiet, that they wanted me to soften my position, that they would fix it if I cooperated, and I told him clearly, without raising my voice, that my position wasn't harsh, it was simply the truth. And I would not erase it to make his sponsors comfortable. He promised me then that he would tell the station he had come involuntarily, that he would handle whatever fallout came his way, but I reminded him that the only way forward was through honesty, not through another layer of performance. And for a moment I saw something flicker in his expression, a recognition that the story had finally outgrown the protection of family narratives and donor meetings, and when I told him I would help him find a lawyer, and that Renee was prepared to stand by him if he wanted to face this cleanly, he said thank you, words I hadn't heard from him in years, and it landed heavier than any speech he could have rehearsed. As I walked away with Aunt Linda's headlights guiding me back to her car, I carried both relief and dread, because I finally had Michael's confession, but I also knew that confessions often get swallowed up by the machinery of reputation. And the only question left in my mind was whether he would stand by his own words long enough to change the course of what was coming. The night before the alumni dinner, I barely slept, not because I was afraid of standing on stage again, but because I knew every word I chose would be dissected, reinterpreted, and perhaps even weaponized by people who had spent years telling me that gratitude was a currency I owed them in exchange for crumbs of acknowledgement, and I lay awake thinking about how many times I had let silence serve as survival, and how different it felt now to realize that silence could also be complicity if I let it become the closing chapter to a story I had fought so hard to drag into the light. Renee sat with me until late, rehearsing not the words themselves, but the posture of refusing to bend, reminding me that brevity would give them fewer hooks to twist, while Aunt Linda, in her blunt way, said I should eat something solid so I wouldn't faint in the middle of my stand, and Miss Carter, ever practical, had slipped another copy of the faculty letters into my bag as though layering armor on a soldier before battle. All of it made the weight both lighter and heavier, lighter because I wasn't walking into the room alone, heavier because their faith in me meant I couldn't afford to falter. When the dinner began, the air in the banquet hall was thick with that artificial warmth institutions manufacture, polite applause, polished introductions, donor names pronounced with reverence. And when my name was finally announced, I walked to the podium with the piece of paper I had folded and unfolded a dozen times that day, the terms I had promised myself I would not betray, and as I stood there I looked out at a crowd that included my parents, seated stiffly at a table near Tom Halpern, who looked like a man watching a chessboard tilt, and for once I felt no need to shrink under their eyes. I spoke for less than 2 minutes, thanking mentors by name, acknowledging the importance of education for first-generation students, and then I delivered the line I knew would echo far beyond that room, saying, I will not apologize for telling the truth about the cost of a degree and the pressure to perform gratitude for help I did not receive. The room did not erupt, but neither did it collapse. Instead, there was a wave of applause from some, a murmur of discomfort from others, and the unmistakable shifting of people recalibrating the story they thought they had already purchased with their donations. I stepped down before anyone could ask for more and slipped through a side door where Renee was waiting, and together we intercepted Michael, who held in his hand the letter Renee had prepared, the one where he admitted to using words that weren't his, where he offered restitution for the stipend, and where he accepted that repairing what had been broken required more than a private confession to me under the dim lights of a driving range. His hands shook as he asked me to promise not to make him a villain, and I told him that I couldn't promise to rewrite reality, but I could promise not to lie, and with that he signed, his name dragging a little across the paper but still legible. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, I believed he had taken a step toward being someone accountable rather than someone protected. Renee told him she would deliver the letter to Pine Ridge in the morning, and the three of us walked out of the building not as a united family, but as three people, bound together by consequences. The aftermath unfolded faster than I could have predicted, because within a day Pine Ridge confirmed that the stipend would be returned to the youth program and that they would update records to ensure accuracy, which was their way of admitting just enough to close the matter without acknowledging the full scale of what had been risked, and the university placed a note in my file affirming authorship of my work, while Ms. Carter hugged me in a hallway where affection usually hides under professionalism, saying only, "You earned this," and those words carried more value than any certificate or donor applause. Aunt Linda insisted we celebrate with pie at a diner off the highway, and as she slid the plate across to me she said, "This is what winning tastes like, ordinary and undeniable," and for once I let myself laugh. Not the nervous kind, but the kind that lives in your chest when you know you have survived something meant to erase you. My parents did not join us at the diner. Instead, they sent a text about family discretion and working together to rebuild trust, which landed like a script recycled from years of rehearsals. And I finally wrote back with a boundary that had been building inside me for years, saying, "No more managing my words. If you want a relationship, start with the truth," and pressing send on that message felt like setting down a weight I had carried since childhood, because I no longer needed their recognition to define my worth. For the first time I saw clearly that love without truth is just performance, and performance was what had nearly consumed us all. I thought that would be the closing scene, the quiet resolution, but later that night my phone lit up with a collect call request from the county jail, and when I accepted, Michael's voice came through the static, subdued but steady, telling me that he had gone to the station for real this time, not to perform but to confess, that he had told them the truth about what had been done with my essay and the stipend, and that he had asked the officer to let him use his one call to reach me, not our parents, not Tom, not anyone else, because for the first time in his life, he wanted someone who would not spin his words to be the one who heard them. I stood in silence as he said, "I will take whatever comes," and I told him that accountability is not a pit you fall into but a path you walk, and he cried just once, a single breath that cracked and then steadied. And before the line cut, he asked me to tell our mother that I had answered, and I promised I would. When the call ended, I stood in the hallway with the hum of the building around me, holding the knowledge that everything had shifted again, because my brother, the one who had been shielded his entire life, had chosen me as his lifeline. And that choice rewrote the balance in a way nothing else could. Later that evening, Renee handed me a folder that had arrived with my name on it, a fellowship offer for public interest work, and she said softly, "Only take it if you want it, not to prove anything," and when I opened it I realized that for the first time, my future was not something to beg for or defend, it was simply mine to step into. My mother sent a message not long after, saying, "We love you and we do not understand you," and I typed back the truest sentence I could manage, "I love you and I will not lie for you." And though it did not close the distance between us, it at least marked the boundary clearly. People sometimes ask me now whether I regret dedicating my speech to those who never believed, and my answer has never wavered. I would not change it, because the dedication was not an attack, it was a mirror. And if the reflection was painful, then that pain belonged to the choices that had been made long before I stood on that stage. And so the story does not end with reconciliation or with family dinners restored, but with something cleaner, something stronger. The knowledge that I chose truth over comfort, and that in choosing it I did not just protect myself. I forced everyone around me to confront what they had spent years pretending not to see.